Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 22nd of August. We're looking at some major updates from the Pokrovsk fronts, then moving on to Toretsk, Klishivka, and also Luhansk, and then finishing off with the situation in Kursk Oblast with that offensive. We have a lot of updates today, but of course, as I said, we're going to begin by looking at these Russian advances going southwards in the same vector that I continuously discuss. This past week, I've highlighted the fundamentals in this part of the front line when it comes to the various trenches that are set up or the topography, and we'll continue to do that today as the Russians really do prove that their momentum has not stopped in this area. They really are taking advantage of the lack of Ukrainian major defensive organized structures, lack of manpower in certain regions, and of course elevation advantage to continue with their momentum. So they've been able to take over this region over here nearly 11 square kilometers and here nearly 9 square kilometers, combined nearly 20. And so the front line we were able to clarify based on a video from the 114th Motor Rifle Brigade of the red banner being raised in the village of Ptiche. And also, this was acknowledged by Petrenko, for instance, that there has been a Russian entrance into this village, although they claim that the southern parts of Ptiche still remains a gray zone. And so what we do know is that at the very least, the Russian forces have been able to advance. If we're measuring it now, we could see here nearly 3 kilometers. So it is a rather large gain, and it is because the Russians were able to advance from their positions established over the past week in Zhavitne in the southeastern direction. And this really put a lot of strain on whatever remaining Ukrainian squads are operating in Komishivka and in the nearby strongholds, so they were really squeezed out, and now there's no means by which the Ukrainians here could actually remain there. So this area is very likely under Russian control given their presence in Ptiche, which means the front line has sort of leveled off for the time being, with the Russians advancing near this really dense forested region west of Skuchne, which directly leads into the first dachas northeast of Kalinove. And so Kalinove serves as a hamlet where a lot of these companies of the Ukrainian forces that have continuously withdrawn from village to village over the past couple of months are now organizing in one central point, because it's the one village in this entire region that is just closest to the front line. It is about 1.2 kilometers away from the line of contact. And you can see there are some scattered defenses here in this rather small dacha area that is near some ponds. So the Russians have been able to successfully clear out several populated villages that would have been really difficult to take had the Russians not conducted their sort of infiltration past Pokrovsk and Vovcha that we discussed in yesterday's video, conducting this loop coming in from the north and flanking the vast majority of the Vovcha River defense line, which is now being taken over by the Russians with very little contention. And so as a result, the Russians are just continuing with this process of going from stronghold to stronghold and flanking them from the north. So you can see here that there are a few other positions that the Russians are rather close to taking, and that the Russians are actually now, for measuring it, around 3 or 4 kilometers away from the northern parts of Karlivka. And this region really has served as not really a massive Ukrainian concentration, but the Ukrainians here have been very steadfast in their defense, both in Karlivka and also in the regions east of the Vovcha River. And now a lot of those efforts will not be able to stand the test of time going into the future because of this northern flank coming in, putting pressure, the potential to cut off any sort of Ukrainian forces near the reservoir crossing. And it could also put into danger this Ukrainian massive stronghold that was built, which is near a local height overlooking the Vovcha River Valley and Karlivka itself. And so a lot of these regions that could have yielded enormous casualties had the Russians sort of assaulted them head on, a lot of that could be averted now due to this Russian push that we're looking at in yellow here. And so besides Kalinove, which is one of the only settlements before the E50 highway, you have Mimrik nearby. That's a rather large town, which previously served as a sort of coordination hub between Selidove to the west and the actual front line to the east. And now it is actually very close to Russian mortar fire, for instance. And so it's under threat of the Russians reaching that region rather quickly. Of course, you have in the open fields and tree lines some defenses that were built by the Ukrainians either since 2014, some that are newer in nature, and then you have trade-offs with both cases because some of the older trenches, they have not been attended to, and then they become more rugged and less deep in certain cases, harder to conceal yourself in. And then some of the newer trenches, they've not been fully completed due to the pace of the Russian advance and due to the orders for the actual trenches being built being given out too late. And so look out for what occurs in Kalinova now, which units are still operating around here, because based on what I'm seeing, it's probably 68th Jaeger Brigade. I still believe 47th Brigade is operating around here until we get evidence to the contrary. There may be some territorial defense forces and then certain elements of the 56th Brigade operating a bit southwards. 25th Air Assault Brigade does appear to have most of its elements located further to the northwest around Zhuravka and Orlivka, but who knows, maybe they have a battalion located further south to sort of act as an auxiliary force to help out. But for now, based on these advances, you could see that definitely the Ukrainians have not been able to establish a temporary fallback line. The closest they were able to do is defend in Zhelane, and since then the pace has really kicked up in its speed, and as a result the Russians have been able to just fully turn Mykolaiivka into this sort of forward node for attack, both towards Marinivka, which they're very close to right now. There's only this one road and stronghold separating them. So the Russians, if we're measuring it now, they're only about 1.4 kilometers away. And this, again, would be a massive danger to Novohordivka's southern flank. But also, you could see how they're infiltrating towards some of the defensive networks that were built just north of Mikhailivka and Selidove itself. And so the Russians now are knocking on the doorstep of this rather strong perimeter of Selidove. And due to the pace at which this has occurred, the Ukrainians have not had enough time to organize a lot of their forces here. And again, the communication from unit to unit is really significant issues. This has really always been the case, but I do believe it's been exacerbated during the Russian momentum that has increased in pace. And that's usually the time where communication is so critical. And we're seeing how that is affecting the Ukrainian cohesiveness. So here you can see how the Russians have already infiltrated portions of the Novohordivka-Selidove line in light yellow. You can see that marked. And so the goal for the Ukrainians at this point should be to establish a solid vertical line from the outskirts of Novohordivka along this road, along the E50, taking advantage of the strong points that were built, which do appear to be rather well built, enough to hold the line for a certain period of time, all the way to Mikhailivka, and then make use of the nearby massive slag heaps to sort of give the Ukrainians parity and in some cases overlook the advancing Russian forces. That should be the defensive plan, but I don't know how many Ukrainian forces are actually operating in the Selidove region as opposed to the east or to areas in the north. So there's a question about how the Ukrainians are really utilizing and dispersing their troops in a way that is proportional and makes sense given the frontline conditions. And so as the fighting in Hrodivka really reaches its pinnacle and the Russians are advancing over there in a way that is threatening to this defense line that you see built in yellow, now you can see that the trenches are fully marked. You have very similar issues when it comes to the building of trenches. You have issues in Hrodivka surrounding the fact that it's on a low-lying river valley. But then for the Ukrainians, the hope would be to extend out the fighting in this particular town for as long as possible in order to buy time for whatever reinforcements or whatever sort of additional engineering work could occur as they set up firing points located in this sort of hilly area just northwest of Hrodivka. That would be the goal. And then for the Russians, of course, the goal is to continue with their advances southwards around Selidove, break through the potential line that is discussed, that is vertical in nature, that connects between Novohordivka and Selidove, break through that point, get control over heights overlooking Selidove to the north, cut off supply lines, take over certain strong points like trenches and slag heaps, and that way establish massive localized dominance over that city, while at the same time utilizing the rail line to the north that passes just to the northeast of Novohordivka to bypass some of these defense lines that you see built by the Ukrainians in yellow, located just south of course, the Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk defensive perimeter. And so that's just a very brief recap of what we're seeing here. And you can see it manifest in the southern direction where the Russians really are making a serious push to reach along a lot of these strong points built just north or just west of the Vovcha River, located further south. And it's something that was totally unexpected. But now the Russians are, of course, taking advantage of that to nullify a massive potential Ukrainian defense line. Now looking towards Toretsk, we have a slight update here. We're zooming in on the northern suburb of Druzhba. Just to confirm, there was a rather small Russian advance. You can see it here marked in yellow. An advance, if we're measuring it out, amounting to somewhere in the ballpark of 500 meters. The Russians actually making a presence near school number 7, as it is referred to. Mark it on the map for you guys. So we know this because of a video released by the 28th Brigade, which is a brigade that, funnily enough, it was actually rediverted away from Toretsk. It was one of the main units defending in Toretsk before the Russian offensive in late June. It was moved further northwards to help stop the Russian advances from further developing in Chasiv Yar itself. And so now we're seeing that it's gradually been moved further and further south once again, and is now largely responsible for the theater between Kurdyumivka and Ozaryanivka. And so, for instance, they have this certain element, the Kursk group, as it is referred to, of the 28th Brigade, and they released this video. It's marked over here, and they launched various ATGM strikes onto Russian positions within the suburb of Druzhba in the eastern portion from positions near a tree line that is concealed, probably over here. It's over here, I believe it is. And you can see that's pretty close to Dakhne. This is an area where you do have this line of defense that was built, and this would be the fallback line for the Ukrainians if they were squeezed out of Druzhba, trying to prevent any sort of flanking operation from Druzhba into Dakhne or from into Krymsky, any other part of northern Toretsk, for instance. And so we do know that this certain element of the 28th Brigade has been redirected further southwards to once again engage with the defensive efforts over here, and that the Russians have made inroads into the actual suburb itself, and that now a certain portion of it is in the gray zone. And regarding this part of the front line, it could be related to the fact that the 95th Air Assault Brigade moved one of their battalions away to fight in the Kursk region. And so to sort of fill that vacuum, the 20th Brigade may have moved in some of their elements. And the 95th Brigade, we're going to get to them later on in the video because they are playing a really active role right now. And a lot of the soldiers from that unit are talking about how they were really quickly moved from one part of the fighting to another without really being informed about it beforehand. So it was a very rapid transition. So here we have another piece of footage. This shows that the Russians advanced 2 square kilometers west of Klishivka, and this basically goes hand in hand with a lot of the things I've talked about regarding the Chasiv Yar front. The fact that the Russians really want to, it's not their highest priority, but it's something that would definitely help them. And it's related to taking over all of the heights located south of Ivanivske, located essentially east of the Donbass Canal, the canal over here where you see all these trenches built nearby, this really well-built Ukrainian defense line. The goal for the Russians would be to secure all of these heights in order to fully overlook the Ukrainian positions west of the canal bank, which actually is on a rather low-lying elevation. For instance, this region here in the forested area is on low-lying elevation, and so is all of this area here south of Stupochki. So the only way to do that is to advance head on and clear out a lot of these fields, tree lines, and fortified areas that you see marked either with the yellow lines or with actual fortresses due to how large they are. And so we now see that at least one of those fortresses has been taken over by the Russians based on a video that I'll mark for you guys here. You can see that it is from the 22nd of August. It's from the Dodo unit, which is this drone element of the 4th Assault Battalion of the 5th Assault Brigade. So we know this unit is still operating around here south of Ivanivske in their defensive efforts. And they just struck a Russian soldier that was walking along this road. So this road is clearly being utilized at the very least by infantry, but probably also they were dismounting from some other MTLB or armored personnel carrier. And this confirms to us a Russian advance past the various trenches on height 215.7 that was taken over last week. And this amounts to around 2.1 kilometers westwards. Then looking a bit northwards, we once again have visual proof that the 98th VDV division has crossed over the canal over here, because previously, once we had information about the Kursk Offensive, the attacks in Chasiv Yar died down. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Russians moved forces away from here, whether it is from the 98th VDV division or from the 200th Motor Rifle Brigade, this Arctic unit that was also fighting in this theater. At the same time, Ukraine also moved a large chunk of their defenses, a lot of battalions coming away from the Chasiv Yar region, so their defense has also been degraded, but it was sort of maybe not fully proportional, but both sides did reduce their presence here, and so there was not much of a serious Russian attempt to advance further. But now we're seeing that the attacks have been relaunched. Russian advance a bit deeper into what is referred to as the Oktyabrski district. 4 Ukrainians surrendered as they were hiding in the ruins of a house here, and they engaged in a 5-minute long firefight with the Russian squad, but eventually they surrendered to those Russian forces who are now conducting these combing operations into the remaining gray zone in this sort of northeastern portion of Chasiv Yar. And in the process, they're also bypassing all these trenches that were really well built by the Ukrainians near the canal that have now been rendered superfluous because the Ukrainians have been forced to abandon them and operate within the actual houses just nearby to the west. Now moving on to Luhansk, I'm talking about this region because the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov, they released an interesting statement on their Telegram channel and also a promo for a new YouTube video they will be releasing, which hopefully will give us more information about their allegations. And so this unit claims that they launched actually a counterattack, a rather significant one, to sort of counter the sort of Russian advances that have been developing over the past couple of months towards Makivka. So if you guys recall, we talked about in previous videos this very serious Russian attempt to advance from positions near Polshchanka, advancing along this particular paved road all the way to Makivka with the hope of then crossing over the Zherabets River and creating finally a solid base past that river to then sort of go southwards and finally clear out this Ukrainian bridgehead over here. And that would do really wonders for the Russians in terms of creating a larger buffer and finally looking westwards towards an area like the Oskil River in the long term. And so that is, of course, a threat to the Ukrainian garrison for a lot of the brigades nearby, not the least of which you have a lot of isolated units in some cases, not full brigades, but in terms of full brigades in Makivka defending, you have the 115th Mechanized, you have, 66th, 117th, or 107th. There's a lot of cases of them. And so the Ukrainians do have a certain amount of troop density here. It's not that low. But then a bit further north, this is an area where there may be a lower concentration of Ukrainian forces due to really the fighting here being really low level in comparison. So the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov, they're operating around this region, and they have been for the past couple of months since being moved away from the Pokrovsk front. And they did not specify where, but they are claiming they were able to advance 2 kilometers deep into the Russian line. Let's just measure that here. 2 kilometers deep would be right towards the outskirts of some nearby villages, this chain of villages that is very important to the Russians, like Kovlalivka, Karmizhanivka, Vodiane, and that's like a organizing point for local Russian companies or even in a larger case, battalions a bit to the east in Svatove. And so the 3rd Assault Brigade, they claim they were able to overrun some of these local company positions during their offensive, and they released a promo video where you see a lot of different facets of this offensive, including tanks, armored vehicles, then, of course, getting support from drone crews dropping grenades onto Russian positions, DPICM cluster munitions being used, coordination between the columns that are advancing, and Ukrainians in command nodes, whether they be within like insulated houses or actually underground in sort of large trench structures that are operating the FPVs. And so it's something that we'll finally know where they're advancing based on the geolocations from their YouTube video when that eventually comes out. And then we'll actually have an idea of whether they did conduct defensive activities around August 15th. And they say that they've been hiding this fact for some sort of operational secrecy purpose ever since. And now they're actually releasing the results of that. And when it comes to the actual facts of the troop disposition, they're saying that they were outnumbered 1 to 2.5. So the Russians had 2.5 times more men than the Ukrainians in this theater, according to them. This is something that can be confirmed. But there is the 3rd Motor Rifle Division. That is the name of the general unit that is operating in this region. And not entirely, because some of its regiments have actually been moved to defend around or attack previously in Vovchansk, and then from there have been moved to actually defend in the Kursk region, like the 252nd Regiment, just off the top of my head. That's one. But then you have a couple of its tank regiments, for instance, and motor rifle regiments that are still here and are involved in defending in an area from Novovodiane all the way to Serhivka. And so just based on my own estimate, it appears there are probably 4 regiments, including 1 tank regiment that are operating around here. So that could be between like 4 to 6, 7, 8,000 at most if we're being generous with the numbers. And then, yeah, it could be feasible in that case if you're only comparing it to one brigade, specifically Azov, which probably has around 2,000 or perhaps even more men in their units, then it would be 2.5 or more. But we don't have a full understanding of whether those regiments are actually operating around here. It's just my own estimate based on their last previously known location. Now, looking at the border between Russia and Ukraine, we do know that last night there were reports from the governor of Kursk claiming that there was an alleged Ukrainian infiltration attempt towards the region of Klimovo, and this is in Bryansk Oblast, really close to this sort of trifecta meeting point between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And since then, we haven't actually received footage of the Russians repelling that attack. We haven't received footage from the Ukrainians showing their operations in the Russian border. So I'm not even sure if this could be considered any sort of large-scale operation, because last night the initial reporting from some Russian sources was that there were 200 involved, and then some mentioned the use of armored personnel carriers. But again, no proof yet. And just as a comparison, when we had reports of Ukrainian infiltration attempts at a larger scale, of course, not at the scale of, for instance, the Kursk Offensive, which really was methodical, well planned out at a battalion level during the initial infiltration. But when you had these smaller squads trying to advance between the area of Grafovka over here to the north, pretty close to the border between Belgorod and Kursk, and then to the south, all the way to an area, for instance, west of Gryvoron, the Ukrainians really had a lot going for them here when it comes to the elevation or being able to utilize local roads and forests to infiltrate the border. But even then, due to the Russians having a well-planned defensive structure here, including trenches, including reinforcements from the 155th Marine Brigade, you could see how it was all structured. And also, it's pretty close to Gryvoron, which is a local Russian hub, which is rather well built, and also Belgorod. So they were able to call in close proximity air sorties and artillery from that region. And so all of those factors combined made it very hard for the Ukrainians to achieve any sort of permanent success across the border, despite there being serious attempts. Of course, like I said before, not to the same extent as Kursk, but there were efforts here that never ended up materializing, so they couldn't end up being connected to the broader offensive operations. And so again, we saw videos of the Belgorod incursions being repelled, and so far I haven't seen anything from Bryansk, so we'll have to wait and see. I'm not going to say anything definitive. Going a bit to the east, we'll just run down through some of the developments over here. Really, there has been a lull around Sudzha as the Ukrainians are mainly focusing on solidifying control, actually sending in engineering units, especially during the night, to begin fortification construction, mining various roads, for instance, to prevent the Russians from ever having an opportunity to come back into this region, really trying to turn it into an area that would leave the Russians bogged down in the long term. You could clearly see their intentions. And then actually also trying to advance eastwards. And the reason for this would be to get control over the second tier of villages located east of Sudzha. The first tier, which would be Mikhailovka and Martinovka, have already been taken over by the Ukrainians. And just to create a large enough buffer zone, they would have to also secure control of Pushkarnoy and Ruskaya Konopelka. And at that point, there would be no large organized Russian settlement under their control near Sudzha for a very, very long time, because all the regions that are east of these two villages that the Russians still retain control over, they really are just open fields, very little paved roads, a lot of forests. So that's one area where for instance, Ukrainians could continue advancing towards Belitsa, but also would make it way harder for the Russians in the short term to try to conduct any sort of counterattack towards an area like Sudzha. So that would be their intention, and that's why they're conducting raids as of August 20th into Ruskaya Konopelka. So far, it's still contested. The Ukrainians have not taken it over. But, even Rybar acknowledges it's contested, and we see fires there from satellite imagery. So there are clashes going on here, and that's the one region where there are attacks going on. And then looking a bit to the north, here we do continue to see attacks in Malaya Luknaya, where the Russians are still in control of a large chunk of this town, especially the northwestern position. We don't have that many videos from the town itself to confirm the exact line of contact. We actually have a video from Pogrebki, which is located a couple of villages north. It's from the 95th Brigade that we talked about earlier on in the video, and it shows strikes on the houses with FPVs. So we know this unit is very active around here conducting these attacks, and that confirms to us that the Russians at the very least are in this village, and that they have an artery through which to actually supply their defenders that are further south in this sort of salient formation. And a lot of Ukrainian sources have been talking about a push coming from the west, basically, from positions near Novoivanovka towards Kruglenkoy, and trying to flank the Russian holdouts in Malaya Luknaya, which include some Marines perhaps, but I know for sure there are some Ahmad forces operating there, maybe from Aida, the 204th Regiment of the Ahmad forces. And the hope would be to, of course, encircle the Russian forces in this position. But so far, there is no concrete evidence of a Ukrainian serious effort at doing that. But there probably are raids going on trying to advance through these forested regions that may, at least on paper, be under Russian control. And for that reason, Krylenkoy probably is in the gray zone. There hasn't been enough proof of a strong Russian presence in that region in recent days. And then this region over here between the Ukrainian line of contact and, for instance, Safonovka, this 10-kilometer area, still a lot of questions raised about it. Not enough proof of the Russians being in Kremennoy in recent days, although a couple of, like 2 weeks ago, we do know that they were operating around here as late as August 12th, so that's 10 days ago. Then looking at Olgovka and Matvivka, Petrenko, they're making the claim that the Ukrainians have been able to take over all of the territory south of this local road, this horizontal road that comes out from Korenovo, then bisects Olgovka, and then also bisects Kremyannoy. And so that is an allegation that would imply the Ukrainians have been able to take over a significant amount of territory, including forests and some villages where there have been a lot of heavy clashes. So far, I haven't seen visual proof to back up all of this. But Petrenko also says that the Ukrainians have been able to take over the village of Korenovo, not the town of Korenovo, but just to the east of the town. There's this village that's called by the same name for whatever reason. From an outside perspective, that doesn't make sense to me. But this particular village, which is basically east of the river here, the Seam River, if we could zoom in, we'll see it. We could see that it's east of the river, the Reka Krepna River, actually. And now the claim being made by Petrenko is that due to all of the pressure coming in from this local road over here, from the mobile squads, from the air assault forces like the 88th, 82nd, from various other units that are attached to them, and also due to the DRG efforts coming in and flanking them from the south along this particular road, this vertical road, that now the Ukrainians have been able to take control over the village in its entirety. But so far, no confirmation of that because we haven't seen the Ukrainians actually operating in the houses. We've seen them near the perimeter, but not actually get in and stay there. An area where they probably are located now, based on forays into these forested regions that you see with the arrows marked, is Krasnotiaborske. And this forest really is now filled to the brim with Ukrainian forces that have been able to turn it into a node through which to then conduct harassment, actually bypass solid lines, and really surprise a lot of Russian aerial forces that are trying to look out for mobile squads because of all the foliage in these forests. And as a result, they've been able to reach this village here all along the Seam River. And based on footage from the 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade of an FPV strike on a house here, we know that there are Ukrainian soldiers operating here. Looking further southwards, the Ukrainians continue to expand their attacks from Snagos, which is now a local sort of node that acts as a springboard for the Ukrainians. You have a lot of operations here from units such as this one, 225th Assault Battalion, also from the 501st Marine Battalion. So they're very active around here. And now I have this video again from the 200th of FPV strikes onto a tank in Komarovka. And so this is an advance on the Ukrainian hand that amounts to around 3 kilometers westwards, really significant advance. Also acknowledged by Rybar, by Petrenko, where Petrenko claims the eastern portion of the village is under Ukrainian control. And then another video here from this village called 10th of October. I don't know what it's called. Or you can see here that it's from August 22nd. It's of a Russian drone spotting a Ukrainian mobile squad. And you can see actual strikes occurring, but you can see that there is a vehicle camouflaged within the village, and then in a bushy area there may be another vehicle. So the Ukrainians are using these camouflaged mobile vehicles to very quickly enter into villages and make their mark, prevent the Russians from staying there as a permanent node. And this confirms to us that the Ukrainians are operating around here, also in the forested areas, while Rybar claims that the push here was eventually repelled. And the implication would be at this point that based on all this activity to the north, that there are no longer Russian soldiers in Byahovo, and that the Ukrainians have probably taken over all of these positions east of the road, this vertical road starting on Snagost and going southwards to Vnezhapnoy. And you could probably say the same thing about Apanasovka. But in terms of the large-scale speculative attacks towards the rest of the Glushkovo district, those have not materialized yet because we're still talking about battalion-sized formations conducting very small attacks in rather small squads, not entire elements of brigades coming in, but just separate battalions engaged in the fighting. And again, in terms of the mobile squads we're mentioning, they were very small in size, like 2 at a time. And so this is not the serious Ukrainian attempt. what we're seeing now is the Ukrainians continuing to utilize a large amount of firepower towards the river crossings, even using the Air Force a lot, for instance, towards Tetkino to the west. But in terms of actual land-based massive advances like we saw in Kursk proper over the past 2 weeks, we are not seeing any sort of deep penetrations or even attempts by the Ukrainians so far. And just to look a bit further north, there's this really interesting video released by Russian sources. And this is, I think, already in Bryansk Oblast, but it's very close to the border with Kursk. And it's near this border crossing, the Nekilitsa border crossing. So you have here a video of 10 Russian vehicles, a part of a large column which included tanks and such, and it's on the A142 highway, and they just fire towards Ukrainian positions on the other side of the border near the border crossing. And people are saying it might be an older video, but it just looks like it's from this time of year. But it doesn't make sense that there would be such a large concentration of Russian vehicles over here at this point in time, as opposed to dispersing them and getting them involved in some of the serious operations and defensive actions that are occurring a bit to the southeast in Kursk. And so then the logical idea would be that the Russians are trying to sort of contain any potential Ukrainian flanking attack from even occurring, because you could see how dangerous that would be, a Ukrainian flanking operation from the north, from this sort of northern appendix towards Rylsk, for instance, if we're looking at a worst case scenario. So I don't know if that's actually the reason why, but it would make sense for the Russians to just try to prevent any sort of Ukrainian attack from this northern flank before it even happens in the first place. So yeah, that's all that I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.